Hello and welcome to a new Oxygen XML webinar. My name is George Bina and I will host the webinar today, and I invited my colleague Stephen Higgs to present and share with you how we collaborate to create documentation. Before we start, here it is some useful information. The most frequently asked question about that we receive for webinars is whether the webinar will be recorded or not. And this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the Oxygen XML YouTube channel as well as on the event page. We reserved at the end some time for questions and answers, but we suggest you to ask questions at any time during the webinar, either using the questions panel in the webinar interface, or you can mark them with the Oxygen XML hashtag or address them to the Oxygen XML account on Twitter, and we'll monitor that and try to respond to your questions. And at the end, we will go through all questions in that allocated space. Without further ado, I will give control to Stephen to start his presentation. Hi, Stephen.
Hello, thanks, George. Okay, so let me get started. Over the years, our world has become more and more reliant on mobile technologies, and most companies have moved towards solutions that maximize efficiency for all areas of their business. And of course, this also applies to the documentation process. And over the last few years, lots of Oxygen users have requested new features that will improve their documentation process, and we certainly listen to that feedback. And of course, we are always continually improving Oxygen to make the process more efficient and accurate, but we also address the collaboration part of the documentation process. And that will be the focus for this webinar. I'll present an in-depth view of our documentation workflow to show real-world use cases of how we use Oxygen products and other tools to collaborate with everyone involved in the process. I'll even show you some of our new products that were specifically designed to make collaboration more simple, efficient, and mobile. And most of these products and tools that I'll be showing you will work with nearly any type of workflow. Of course, every company has their own organizational structure, workflow, and set of requirements, but even if ours is quite different from yours, I'm hoping that you will be able to get some ideas for how some of these tools and ideas could improve your collaboration process. I'll start with a quick overview of our documentation workflow. First off, these are more or less the types of contributors that are involved in our process. The developers, who are of course responsible for all the coding and implementation of improvements and new features. The quality assurance team is responsible for testing everything, and they also proofread changes and additions in the documentation. The support team sometimes receives feedback from users that require changes in the documentation. Subject matter experts might include developers, people from other departments, or members of the community that often offer feedback, suggestions, or actual content. And of course, the documentation team works with all of them. Now let me quickly show you what we're ultimately trying to achieve. So we basically have 10 main products. These are the types of output that we use. And for the first 6 products, we generate 5 types of output or 30 user manuals. For the next 3, 2 types, an additional 6 user manuals, and for the last one, 1 additional one. So 37 user manuals, and we're responsible for numerous other types of documentation, but regardless, they all fit into our overall workflow and collaboration process. So to get to the end result, most of the time our workflow looks something like this. It starts when somebody determines there's a need for an addition or change in the documentation, and then progresses through numerous stages and teams. Now, if I was to put this into some sort of timeline graph, it would look something like this, where it passes between various teams, and each team may have numerous steps depending on the particular situation. So between the two graphics, you can see how complex and time-consuming it can become. But I'm going to show you how we use various collaboration tools to eliminate some of these steps and make the whole process more efficient without sacrificing quality. Many of you may actually have an even more complicated workflow, or you may have to deal with challenges such as contributors being spread out across multiple locations, and many of us face the challenge of working with numerous different types of collaborators who may not have access to the same applications or may not have the same level of writing skills. Well, some of the nice things about most of the tools I'm going to show you is that they work with virtually any type of workflow. The contributors only need access to a web browser, and they are very simple to use. So as for the tools that we use in our documentation process, everyone involved in the process uses Atlassian JIRA for issue tracking and project management. The documentation team uses Oxygen XML Editor or Author to create and manage the content. Various teams use Oxygen ContentFusion, Oxygen XML Web Author, and Oxygen Web Help for collaboration tools. For our documentation, we use Git for the file repository and version control system. We use GitHub to host our Git repository, and we use SourceTree to manage the changes in versioning in a visual GUI. Now I'll start showing you some real-world use cases by showing you how we use these tools. First off, I'll show you how we use JIRA, which is, like I said, an issue tracking application. And I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on this one since it's a third-party app and every company has their own way of managing and tracking projects, but in most instances this is where our documentation process begins and ends, so I thought it might be helpful to show. So JIRA is highly customizable, and there's a variety of different dashboards and ways to filter, search for issues, and each of our teams use it differently, but I'll show you how I use it. So I basically have 5 filters that I use, and one of them is for documentation tasks. These issues have a very simple workflow, and there's only 3 possibilities for status: open, documented, or closed. And it basically starts when someone from one of our teams determines there's a need to add or change something in the documentation. And there's numerous different possible sources for this type of task, but it usually comes from feedback from users, or one of our team members sees something that needs to be changed, and I'll often add this type of task when I see a need for a documentation project. But this, for these documentation tasks, this is the beginning of the documentation process. For the other 4 filters, these are for issues that are in a verified status, and they're from our current development version for our various products. So I have one for the Oxygen XML suite of products, one for ContentFusion, one for Web Author, and one for Web Help. And these type of tasks come from new features and improvements that are currently in development, and they have a much more complicated workflow. So you can see that there's a variety of different types of statuses, and we could call them stages. And while the documentation tasks that I was showing you, they start at the beginning of the documentation process, these type of tasks have already progressed through numerous stages of development, And once they reach this verified status, that means that they're ready for the documentation phase. So basically, any type of documentation task that is in an open status, or any type of other task that is in a verified status, that means that it's reached the documentation phase, and this is just the beginning of our documentation process. Remember, I showed you a graphic of our workflow. Well, at this point, we're at the very top of the diagram. So let me show you an example. So this was a documentation task that was added because of feedback from a user, and the reporter, one of our developers, pasted the actual email from the user, and let me go to comments so it's not so. And in this instance, they listed the topic and the specific content that needs to be changed. Basically, we have an option, and in our documentation, we originally said that this setting is not available for Mac, but the user found a solution for this. So in the documentation, you see that I added a tip that basically tells them how to use this option on Mac. Now, I haven't committed this yet because I wanted to show you. So what I would do is I would come over to source tree, and I'm going to commit, and I'm going to use the JIRA issue number. And this is important, and I'll show you why in a minute. And I'll explain. And now it's been committed. You see that it shows the JIRA issue number here. Again, like I said, I'll show you why. And then I'll come back over to JIRA. I'll resolve the issue. I'll say what I did. And now you see that it is now in documented status. And then once it changes any type of status, everyone involved in the issue will be notified of the change in status, and when it reaches the documented status, the QA team will be notified, and then they can review and proofread the changes. And I'll show you their process in a few minutes as well. So once the documentation is reviewed, if they see a problem, they'll reopen the issue, add comments, or if they agree that it's now resolved, they'll close the issue, and the change in the documentation is now part of the current development branch, and it will appear in the output whenever that particular version for that particular product goes to the publishing stage. And the other type of issues are similar. You see that they have a lot more activity and a lot more information, and that's because they've gone through all the stages of development. But now that they're in verified status, they're ready for documentation, and the process at this point is the same. It goes through all the phases of the documentation process and eventually gets scheduled for publishing. So now that you have a basic understanding of our workflow, I'll move on to start showing you how we use some of the collaboration tools. So first, I'll show you how we use our new product called Oxygen ContentFusion. It's a collaboration tool that makes the review process very efficient. And I should note that it is currently in the beta stage, but it'll soon be released to the public. Now, while other teams and colleagues use some of the other tools, I now actually pretty much exclusively use ContentFusion whenever I need documentation reviewed, and you'll see why. For a content author, I can't imagine a better way to collaborate unless the other person happens to be at your desk working with you. And with ContentFusion, you can collaborate with anybody, no matter where they are. It's very simple for the reviewer, and they don't need to have access to your project or any of your tools. All they need is access to the internet and a browser. So let me show you how it works. So ContentFusion is an add-on, and once it's installed, this icon appears on your toolbar. If I click that icon, it opens this view. And this is where you can create and manage tasks. If this was the first time I was using it, I would have had to connect to the server, create a new account, but of course I've already done that and it's all very simple. So let's suppose that I've created this document and I want a subject matter expert to review it. And in our case, the expert is usually one of our developers. For example, if I'm documenting a new feature, I would want the particular developer that implemented that new feature to review the document. There are several ways to add files to a task. I can drag from the Data Maps Manager or the project view and drop it in this box. Or if I just want to add the current document, I can right-click anywhere in the editing panel and select Add File to Review Task. But since I'm working with data, I usually drag it from the Data Maps Manager. And the reason for doing that is it automatically detects the context map. And this is going to be your root map, and the purpose of this is so that all the references and defined keys can be resolved and displayed properly for the reviewer. And then I'm going to add a description. And click Upload. And while it's uploading, I'll just note that the description I just added will help differentiate between multiple tasks. So each description should be unique. I usually use the JIRA issue number, the date, the person or persons that I'm sending it to. And you see that each task has its own box. I can click on the description and it opens the task details in the ContentFusion interface in my default browser. Now I want to share this task, so I'll click the share button. I'll copy this automatically generated link and I'll send that link to the subject matter expert. Now I actually want to show you what they will see, so I've created a dummy account for a fictitious reviewer named Mary. And if I was that reviewer, I would simply click the link that was sent to me or paste it into the browser. And you see they see the task details similar to what I saw, but with a few less options. All they have to do is click the file name and it opens it in a version of Oxygen XML Web Author that's integrated into the ContentFusion interface. Notice that the reviewer sees the topic in the exact same structure as the content author. They see what I see. And the reviewer can make changes. And notice that by default it forces the change tracking feature to be enabled. This is so that the content author will always be able to see exactly what was changed. They could add a comment. And notice that any change appears over here in the review panel. Notice that they also have access to a lot of the toolbar buttons that you're used to in Oxygen. They can also add a message over here in the left panel. This is basically a way for them to communicate with the content author and anyone else that the link was sent to. And the content author is notified that there's a message here, so they can click a link to see the messages. I'll show you that in a minute. So when they're done reviewing, they just need to click Finalize Review. This notifies the content author that they are finished. And now if I go back to Oxygen, so you notice that it shows that I have 2 new messages and a file change. Like I said, if I click the messages, it takes me to the task details. I can see their specific messages. Now to merge the changes, I can simply click this Get Changes link. And this will open a built-in merge tool that allows me to automatically merge all the changes back into Oxygen. So the reviewer didn't have to commit anything to the repository. I didn't have to pull changes from the repository. The reviewer didn't need access to my project or Oxygen. This tool automatically gets their changes from the ContentFusion server, and I can merge the changes with this built-in tool. Here it comes. Oh, and by the way, if you're already familiar with our built-in file comparison tool, notice that it now has a visual author mode as well as the usual text mode. This is a new feature that's currently in development, and it'll be available in an upcoming release. Anyway, this merge tool includes numerous options for manually adjusting the merge operation, but typically that's only required if there's some sort of conflict. Most of the time I can simply click Apply, and now I see that their changes have been merged into my document, and I can address them. Accept or reject the changes, address the comments, etc. Now, if you want more information about ContentFusion, here's the link once again to the website, and my colleague will also paste this link into the GoToWebinar console. But I'm sure you see why this is the collaboration tool that I use most frequently. It's very simple and efficient for both the reviewers and myself. I tend to get better feedback from the reviewers because they see exactly what I see, and all they have to do is click a link, review the file, click a button to finalize, and that's it. And from my perspective, I can automatically merge their changes in seconds. The content always stays in the same form, and I always see exactly what was done, and it eliminates numerous steps in my process. In fact, I've been working here and using Oxygen for about 3 years, and the developers have added a lot of nice new features and improvements in that time, but I can honestly say that in my opinion, this is by far the best feature that I've seen. This, of course, is coming from the perspective of a technical writer, but I am just amazed at how much this feature has enhanced my whole documentation process. Anyway, ContentFusion wouldn't be possible without Oxygen XML Web Author, and that leads me to the next use case. In this one, I'll show you a use case for using Web Author for collaboration between the support team and the documentation team. And for this use case, I'm going to use a specific example of something that actually happened very recently. So it's this one. Okay, so one of our support engineers received feedback from a user that was trying to create a custom refactoring operation. Well, one of the steps for this is to create what is called an operation descriptor file. So they used the information in this topic to create the descriptor file, but it didn't work. So the support engineer researched it, and they determined that the problem was that in one of the code blocks, this particular attribute should have been placed in the parent element. So they determined exactly what needs to be changed in the topic, and of course they they could send this in an email and explain it, or they could create a JIRA issue, but instead they can save time and ensure accuracy by adding the comment directly in the source. So we've configured our web help system to include an edit link. And by the way, you can also do this in PDF output. So when our support engineer clicked this link, it opened that specific document in Oxygen XML Web Author. And just like in the last use case, they see exactly what I see, but in Web Author. So they went to the specific code block, highlighted the attribute, and added a comment. Basically just telling the documentation team that this attribute needs to be moved to the parent element. Now we've configured our web author to be connected to our Git repository. So all they need to do is select commit from this Git drop-down menu. They can add a commit message. They select the branch. If they commit on our current development branch, I'll see it directly on that branch. Otherwise, they can create a new branch, and I'll still see it, but I'll simply need to merge it into the dev branch. And I'll go to source tree and show you some examples. So if there's any pull requests, I see them here. And the branch to the far left, this blue one, is my current development branch, or dev. And actually this one. Here's an example of where someone else committed directly on the dev branch. And I always look in the author column to see who committed. Here's an example of where they committed on another branch. Here's an example of where I merged. Anyway, back to our specific example. Like I said, I look at all the changes that are committed by others. So once it was committed and pulled, I then opened that particular topic in Oxygen, and I can see their comments, and I can address it. So in this particular instance, from my perspective, the advantage of the support engineer using Web Author to point out something that needed to be changed is that I see their specific comment exactly where the change needs to be made, and they eliminated several steps in the documentation process by adding their comment directly in the source. And not only did it save time, but ensured accuracy. Next, I'll show you how our quality assurance team uses a combination of tools during the collaboration process. Remember that I said after the documentation team finishes our initial process, the QA team proofreads the changes. So let me show you their typical process. So once a JIRA issue reaches the documented status, this is when the QA team can look at the documentation. And here's an example. See, it's in documented status, and once, like I said, once it reaches the status, they are notified, and as long as I have used the JIRA issue number when committing the changes, remember I showed you that when I committed I used the JIRA issue number. Now I'll show you why. So they'll see any commits for this specific JIRA issue here. All I have to do is click this link, and they can click each particular file. This will open it in GitHub, and this is just a very basic preview of the changes, and here all they're doing is making sure that they don't see any structural or procedural issues. Then they'll go back to JIRA, and we've also configured JIRA to include a web author bot. So again, as long as I've used that JIRA issue in my commit, it'll show the files here, and they will click on the file, and this will open that particular file in Web Author. And just like in the last scenario, they see what I see, they'll review the file, and if they see a problem, they can make changes or add comments. They'll commit their changes, just like in the last scenario, and I'll see their changes in source tree. Once I pull their changes and open the file in Oxygen, I see their comments or changes. So just like in the previous scenario, this eliminated several steps in the documentation process, since they're able to make the changes or add comments directly in the source document. And from the QA team's perspective, it's very easy and efficient, since we've configured JIRA to allow them to simply click some links, which opens the committed files in GitHub or Web Author, and again, they see what I see without needing access to my project. Next, a little about our versioning control system. So our developers use SVN for their version control system to manage changes in the code, but occasionally some of them will also contribute new topics for the documentation. And as I've mentioned, for our documentation, we use Git for our version control system. We host it on GitHub, and we use SourceTree for the visual GUI. Now, some of our developers will use Web Author to contribute a new topic. So they'll probably create a new topic from a template, or maybe they'll edit an existing topic. But regardless, once they're done, they'll commit it, just like I showed you before. Similarly, some of our other developers will create the new topics in Oxygen XML Editor. They'll commit using SourceTree, just like I do, and regardless of which product they use, I see their commits here in SourceTree. And as I mentioned earlier, whenever I see pull requests, I always look for the author column. I look for the specific file that was committed, and like I said, if they commit on the dev branch, I will see it directly on that branch. If they committed on another branch, then I have to determine whether or not it needs to be merged into the dev branch. I always also look at the preview of the change in this SourceTree preview panel, and it's also very easy to differentiate between small additions to existing topics or new topics, because they have different icons. So these ones are for modified, this one is for an added topic. So when the developers do add a new topic, I open that particular file in Oxygen, proofread it, I'll reference it in the appropriate spot in the data map, and continue on with the documentation process. So this type of scenario usually happens if the developer has something very technical that needs to be added in the documentation, and they've determined that it's just as easy for them to create a new topic and commit it as it would have been for them to add all the information in a JIRA issue. And of course, from my perspective, it saves a lot of time, because it's obviously faster for me to proofread an already created document and then make adjustments from there. And it ensures that the document will be more accurate because it was originally written by the expert. And again, we eliminated numerous steps in the process. Now we also use the Oxygen Web Help system with feedback enabled for collaboration with end users, and we often use this to improve our documentation. And I'll show you a specific example. Oh, wait. So whenever a comment has been added in our web help system, we receive a notification by email. And all I need to do is click this link, and it opens that specific topic in our web help output. In this case, a user asked for more clarification, and one of our developers offered a solution, and they also indicated that we'll update the documentation so that it's more clear. So this then became a JIRA issue. And if I open that topic in Oxygen, you'll see that it has been changed significantly. It now has a very clear procedure that tells them exactly how to do this. And of course, we don't yet see this in Web Help, and that's because the changes were committed on the current development branch, and they will make it to the published output when the next version is released. But in the meantime, this Web Help system allows us to offer solutions in the meantime, because all the comments will be visible to everybody. And as Radu did here, he offered a solution until the next publishing date. Now, sometimes we decide that a change should be pushed to the output sooner than the next release. Let me show you how that works. So here's a graph of a release timeline. And of course, with each release, either minor or major release, we publish a new version of our documentation. But we also publish it more often than that. For example, when we release maintenance builds in between versions, we'll republish the documentation at that point. But of course, we can't use the current development branch because it will include information that can't be published until the next version is released. So what we do is we create a branch called hotfixes, and at the time of each release, we create a new sub-branch. So the latest one is hotfixes/19.0. At the time of release, the dev branch is merged into this new hotfixes branch, and they're identical. But then at that point, they branch off, and the dev branch starts receiving commits for the next release, while the hotfixes branch may just receive a few commits here and there. But this allows us to push information in between releases. So I'll go back to source tree and show an example. So here's my current branch. It's thinking. I don't know why it's not navigating to it, but here's an example. So here's a few commits that were committed on the hotfixes branch. These were things that we determined needed to be pushed to the output sooner than the next release. And you'll notice that there's just a few here and there, while the dev branch has tons of commits. So anytime the documentation is published in between releases, we always use this hotfixes branch. That way, of course, it will include everything that was in the dev branch back at the time of the release since they were merged, but then the only additions will be those commits that we've added to that branch. So that's basically how we use web help and a special branch to provide selective updates to the documentation between releases. And now I'm going to show you a little bonus. So the last thing that I want to show you real quick is a new plugin that our developers are working on. So I've showed you some ways that we use GitHub and SourceTree to commit changes to our Git repository. Well, we've had a lot of requests for integrating a Git client directly into Oxygen. Not only would that be much more efficient, but applications such as SourceTree aren't even available for Linux, for example. And if you're familiar with Git command line syntax, then I suppose that isn't a problem. But even if you are, it would obviously be nice if the commands could be executed directly in Oxygen. So what our developers have done is to create an add-on that contributes a view that is a very basic Git client. So once you install the add-on, you now have access to this Git staging view. And it just provides some basic support for committing changes directly from Oxygen, comparing and merging changes, and other Git commands. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because it's still in development, like I said, but I'll show you what it looks like in its current form and you'll get an idea of what you'll be able to do with it. So at the top you have buttons for push, pull, change branch. You can change the directory if you work with multiple projects. This next window shows all the unstaged files. If I stage them, then they move to the next window, which is the staged files. Once they're staged, I can add a commit message and commit. There's also some contextual menu actions. For example, if I choose to open the file, it'll open it in the editor. I could also choose Open and Compare Editor, and this will open it in the built-in file comparison tool where you can see the actual changes. You have various options for merging changes. You can drill deeper into the comparison, etc. As I said, it's currently in development, and I'll show you that slide again so that you can see the link. So if you want more information about this add-on, you can go to this link, and my colleague will also post this in the GoToWebinar console so that you have access to it. So those are all the primary ways that we collaborate for our documentation process, the tools that we use, and even some that are in development. Hopefully you saw some interesting things that might help you with your collaboration process, and you saw how we use these tools to eliminate steps in our process and ensure accuracy. And if this was the first time you've seen products such as ContentFusion or Web Author, maybe you're thinking about ways that they could be integrated into your collaboration process. And since everyone's workflow and needs can be so diverse and complex, we suggest that you email us with your specific requirements so that we can offer you suggestions catered to your specific situation. And that brings me to the end of my demonstration. I'll send controls back to George so that he can expand and answer some questions.
Thank you, Stephen. We did actually receive a good number of questions, and let's try to get through some of them. So first was about pricing information for Oxygen ContentFusion. So right now Oxygen ContentFusion is in beta, hosted by us. We already developed also an on-premise distribution, so you can install it on your own servers. Once it will end the beta stage, we plan to offer some subscription packages. We are thinking to have this for the authors and not for the reviewers. So the reviewers will be able to access the content, and only authors will need a subscription for Oxygen ContentFusion for this hosted version. While for the on-premise version, at least the current idea is to have that available if you get a web author package, subscription package like 100 floating or 1000 floating licenses. Will provide ContentFusion without any additional cost, so you can just connect the existing web author licenses to work with ContentFusion, as well as to work directly on different repositories like Git or WebDAV and so on. Another question was whether ContentFusion is hosted and does it integrate with Git. So Oxygen ContentFusion right now is hosted. It's available as hosted. You can get a plugin, the ContentFusion connector plugin, automatically from Oxygen. It's available on the default update site, and you can use it during the beta period, the hosted version. If you want to try it on premise, then you can contact us and we will provide you an installation kit to test it on premise. But ContentFusion does not integrate with Git. The Oxygen Web Author has a Git connector. So using the Web Author, you can connect to files on Git repositories. Okay. Is there a way for a reviewer to see the documents as they will look like when once published? So we do not provide right now an action to publish the current, to preview, let's say, the currently edited document. And sometimes it is not possible because the tasks created in ContentFusion may not include all resources. Although when you create a task, we try to determine, as Stephen presented, if there's a data map. If there is a root data map, then we will automatically get all related resources, so different dependencies will automatically work. We have in mind such preview support, maybe to render a topic as HTML or PDF, and it may be available in the future, or it may be integrated with some other publishing mechanism. Another answer that we provided during the webinar was that you have an option to see the final form of the document. So if you say click view final, you see that then you see the added content will be there, and maybe if we delete something, you should be able to see that the deleted content disappears. So you can see the final, the original, or the changes highlighted in the document. And it was also requested if we can show this at the end. Okay. Can review requests be sent to multiple reviewers at once? Can multiple reviewers work simultaneously? So we received a couple of questions related to having multiple users access the same topic. And the answer is yes, you can share a topic or multiple topics, a task, a review task with multiple users, multiple reviewers. And the ContentFusion provides right now an automatic locking mechanism to prevent conflicts. So only one will get access to a specific edit action, access to a specific topic. Only one user at a time. Does Fusion rely on IDs in data? In other words, do I have to let me see, to insert will I have to add more IDs than usual? No, ContentFusion does not require you to add IDs or anything in the document. It just shares the document. Can you send content to multiple reviewers at one time and have reviewers review one after another? Yeah, so basically relates to the same concurrent access to the file. So we have that locking mechanism that will provide edit access to one reviewer at a time. So there will be no conflicts basically on ContentFusion. Okay. Can ContentFusion be set up that authors can see each other edits? Well, the file on ContentFusion contains the latest version, let's say, of that file, and by default, review task enables track changes. So all changes made to a topic are recorded with author information. So anyone looking at the topic on or at an XML file in general on ContentFusion will be able to see what changes were made by who. Can the web author only be integrated with Git or it can be integrated with other CMS systems like Perforce or versioning system like Perforce? So the web author has an API that allows it to connect to different repositories, and we provide such connectors for Git, SharePoint, WebDAV, and there are also a number of content management systems that implemented such connectors for their content management systems. The connectors that we provide are available as open source on GitHub, on the github.com/oxygenxml on our account. And for Perforce, we have a prototype integration. It's not yet finalized, so if any one of you is interested, please get in touch with us at support@oxygenxml.com, and once we have something available for test, we can give you early access to that. Now regarding the web help comment functionality that Stephen showed, presented earlier, a question was whether we clear comments at every build release. And the answer is yes. Once you respond to a comment by updating that topic, that comment is not relevant anymore, so it can be removed. But sometimes comments may remain maybe between different publishing stages. How many authors do you have on team? Was the questions. And we have 2 authors, and I think about 25, 30 subject matter experts, which basically are, most of them are Oxygen developers. When developers create a topic, did you say that they use Oxygen XML Editor? Why not Oxygen XML Author? Well, Oxygen XML Editor is a superset of Oxygen XML Author. So, and usually our developers will work not only on visual editing, but they will work maybe with XSLT and so on, which is available, and support for XSLT, XML schema, and so on is available in the Oxygen XML Editor. And because the editor contains all the visual editing and all the XML author functionality, of course they will use the Oxygen XML editor. Usually a deployment in an Oxygen deployment for documentation means Oxygen XML author for most of the authors. A few power users will probably want to have Oxygen XML editor. These users maybe modify the XSLT scripts or schemas, customized schemas or DTDs and so on. So they need also the development, XML development functionality. And then you can have web author licenses for collaboration and maybe use ContentFusion for peer-to-peer review like Steven presented. Someone was happy to see this webinar and the collaboration documentation process that we use at Oxygen. Again, a question about recording. Yes, the webinar is recorded and the recording will be available. Another question about concurrent reviewing. It's nice for reviewers to be able to see and react to each other's comments and suggested edits. It is not clear from your answer so far whether this use case is supported. Yeah, so basically, whenever someone will edit a file, that file will be locked, and only that user will be able to modify it. Once he moves away from that file, the content is available to any other user. So they will be able to see each other changes and comments and so on. Okay.
Also, George, to mention, you'll see on his screen over in the left in the messages, it has a timestamp. So you see real time whenever a comment was left there and changes to the file, and it's sequential. And like you said, if there is a locking mechanism, so if you close the browser or navigate back to the task details screen, then it'll unlock that file, and any of the other reviewers can then click on that file and then start editing, and they'll see everything that has been changed in the file up to that point, up to that minute. And also, if you happen to stay on the file without activity for too long, it will automatically lock temporarily. It'll offer a link to continue editing if nobody else has started editing. But this is a way that basically, if you start reviewing a file and then walk away and forget about it, at least it doesn't stay locked forever. It'll automatically lock at some point, and then others can start editing.
Yes, thanks, Steven, for this additional info. And here in the settings, you can see the force track change tracking on option. That's the default for a task that I mentioned. Sometimes maybe for some tasks you may not want necessarily to have track changes, because in any case, when you integrate the content back, you will be able to see the actual changes. So you may not necessarily need, especially if you collaborate one-on-one, you may not need to have track changes all the time. Another addition to our collaboration tool is also Slack. So we integrated GitHub, for instance, and Slack, and any comment, any change made to the documentation appear on the documentation channel in Slack, for instance. So for me, if I want to stay up to date with what's going on, I can just look at the Slack documentation channel. That's another way to to work, to collaborate. Let's move on a bit and just highlight some of the upcoming events where you can meet our team in person. So you can meet us in Stuttgart, Germany at TC World by TCOM. Then we organized this year another edition of the Data Open Toolkit Day, which is a free event for Data Open Toolkit users. And it's a full day of interesting sessions where we gather the main developers of the Data Open Toolkit project, as well as Data Open Toolkit users. And it's great. It's the 4th edition, I think, this year, and it's just before Data Europe at the same location as Data Europe, and a couple of days after TC World. After that, we'll be at LavaCon in Portland at the beginning of November. And in general, you can find more information about the events on our website. So company events, and you can find here, the webinars. Sorry, scroll there. Like this one is promoted here. Then different events that we sponsor, maybe like XML Summer School, the TC World Conference, when we have a number of sessions, Data Open Toolkit Day, Data Europe Conference, LavaCon, TI members meeting, as well as you can find also all the past events, recorded webinars, conferences we participated at. Sometimes there are video recordings also at different presentations made at those conferences, like XML Prague, for instance, which record the sessions. So thank you, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Stephen has a few more webinars planned, so hope to see you soon. And thank you, Stephen, for your session, for your presentation.
Sure, thank you.
Goodbye.